I'm a real believer that we, should not be paternalistic about these AI technologies. We should put the technologies in the hands of people who could benefit most from them. 86% of those that had used the generative AI tool couldn't remember what they'd written. They couldn't remember a single quote from what they'd written. They must be transparent. They must be trustworthy. And I really believe as well, technology has to be trustworthy if we want to see adoption of these technologies.
We have Dympna O'Sullivan, who leads the Digital Futures Research Hub at TU Dublin as our guest today. Dympna, very, very good to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Mark. Delighted to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about AI, we're going to be talking about healthcare, and then we're going to talk about people living with dementia and some of the research and some of the work that you're doing there. But before we go on that journey, tell me a little about some of the work that you do now, but then also your journey into your role now.
Okay, sure. So thanks for having me. As I said, my name is Dympna O'Sullivan from TU Dublin. I lead a research hub there, and my own research, my own personal research, I suppose it sits at the intersection of AI, digital health and assistive technologies. So I'm really focused on developing AI-driven technologies to support people with everyday tasks. And the people that I work generally with are persons with age-related cognitive impairments, like mild cognitive impairment or dementia. Or I also work quite closely with St. John of God's Community Services, where we develop assistive technologies to support people with intellectual disabilities. And I'm a real believer that we, should not be paternalistic about these AI technologies. We should put the technologies in the hands of people who could benefit most from them, and let them tell us how they can benefit from these technologies. So my work would follow very much a co-design approach with end users. I would work very collaboratively with persons with age-related cognitive impairments, persons with intellectual disabilities, in order to co-design, develop and evaluate these kind of technologies.
So in one way, we're living a lot longer than we did before, but suddenly we're actually having more kind of cognitive disabilities that it's becoming really, really common. For 5-10 years ago, where there's probably somebody within your close circle that's going to have either kind of Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, or some of them. And the impact that has for society in terms of managing and minding these individuals to have that, but also trying to allow them just to live regular lives is a real challenge now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the key issue really is that health span is not keeping up with lifespan. We are aging, but we're not aging healthily into these kind of longer years. So if you take a condition, for example, like dementia, there's about 64,000 people in Ireland have a dementia diagnosis, but we know it's very underdiagnosed. 11,000 people are diagnosed each year with dementia, and by 2045, we expect there to be more than 150,000 people in Ireland with dementia. That'll be about 2.5% of the population. 500,000 people in Ireland have a family member with dementia. There are about 80,000 informal caregivers. There are families or friends who provide care to people with dementia. And at the same time, we have this push towards community care, so care in your community, hospital at home. And most people with dementia actually do want to live at home, but with the right supports. And this is, I suppose, the issue. We have a healthcare system that's creaking with this aging population. And I suppose what we would see in our research a lot is that there's a very long gap, potentially up to 2 years, between where somebody might present to their GP or another service with memory concerns and a formal diagnosis. And that's a really key area where if the right supports are not instigated, people can go downhill really, really quickly. So we would see technology, including AI-based technology, as a service that can kind of plug the gap, and with an AI-based technology that can deliver the right interventions at the right time to people in order for them to live independently at home. And that's what most people want to do. They want to live at home. They want to live in their communities. But without the right supports, that can be really very difficult.
Yeah, and we always kind of refer to that, there's no place like home. And, it's so true, particularly if you've been traveling or you come back, you've kind of got that safe place, and we can really, really relate to that. Tell me about your work with ethics. Of just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should, and what you're teaching your students and the kind of golden thread that kind of shapes you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose all my research, all my teaching, I would say it's very ethics informed. Previously, I led a project called Ethics for You, where I developed a European ethics curriculum for computer science students across Europe, and that's been, very widely adopted. I completely agree with you. Just because we should doesn't mean we can, and oftentimes I think we're using AI to solve the wrong problems. Let's think about let's think more creatively about how, the kind of problems we should be using AI to solve. I mean, in the context of dementia, this is really important that we take an ethics-led approach. A really big issue there is the issue around informed consent. Okay, so obviously these AI technologies, if we're talking about independent living at home, they're gathering a lot of personal data about people's routines within their own homes. It's really important to tell users, well, what happens to that data? Where does that data go? How is that data processed? What is the cloud? How do we kind of aggregate this data to personalize it for your experiences? And in terms of informed consent, I suppose the thinking around that is changing. Certainly in the medical field, we believe that people can give consent until very late in the process. The other thing is that people can consent maybe one day and not the next. That's the nature of the condition. So I think for older adults, people with age-related cognitive impairments, we need to start thinking about dynamic models of consent. Consent isn't a one-time event, and we need to have sort of ethics processes that go along with that. But I suppose in terms of how this is ethics-led, it must be human-centered. This is a prime example of when we need human-centered AI. These technologies, they must be transparent. What are they doing? How will they benefit you? But, what are the risks? And unfortunately, what we see is that maybe somebody with an age-related cognitive impairment or somebody with an intellectual disability, they often have to give up more of their personal data to get the same service that a user without a cognitive impairment would have to do, right? And that's a trade-off, right? A privacy trade-off. They must be transparent. They must be trustworthy. I mean, and I really believe as well, technology has to be trustworthy if we want to see adoption of these technologies. And they have to solve real problems that people want solved. That's the people-centered part of it.
Yeah. And so I agree with you. So trust is the foundation, because ultimately it's very hard to scale without trust, because there's always going to be a nagging clip to say,
Yes.
You haven't done this, or what's the ethics around that, or what's the challenge around that. But there's also the element of you just need the people to start to trial this and use this,
Yes.
and get some feedback to say, actually, this is working, this is not working,
Yes.
because there's this kind of trial and error approach that you can see. From a loved one's perspective, it's so damaging when you've grown up with your heroes or people who've minded you all your years, always sharp as an axe, and then they're losing it. They can't remember your name. They can't recount memories. It's over and over again. Like it's crushing as a family member seeing this.
Yeah, it's like multiple deaths is what they call it. Yeah, it really is. I mean, some of the ways I suppose I've developed myself, this is collaborative work between myself and my colleague, Dr. Julie Doyle, who's at Netwell Casala Centre in Dundalk Institute of Technology. And we've developed this assistive technology toolkit to support people with dementia to live independently at home. And I suppose some of the functionalities that we see where we have embedded in the toolkit, certainly things around daily reminders, really, really important. It's really important when you have a dementia diagnosis to just carry on with the same dead, boring activities that you've been doing all your lives. And the worst thing is when somebody gets a dementia diagnosis, there's a real, what often happens is, the carer says, oh, you sit over there, you don't do anything. Yeah. And it's the worst thing you can do. So we would use technology very much as a nudge kind of tool. So we have a daily planner, good morning, Mary, it's 9 a.m. It's time to take your medication. At 11 a.m., your daughter is coming to visit you. At 3 p.m., you have a medical appointment, but we have to remind people throughout the day, if you have a medical appointment at 3 o'clock, maybe you need to start getting ready for that earlier in the day. You have to take a bus or so on. AI as well in our tool, it's really important, and where we found really good utility is multi-step tasks. So for example, preparing a meal. So generative AI can speak you through the steps in that. We've also developed a smart mirror that allows people to work through their morning hygiene routine. Again, and voice-based prompts, really, really important in that. Other functionality, we have a suite of sensing technology that underpins the toolkit. So in the early stages of the condition, things like wearables are very important because people are, managing their own condition, right?
Yeah.
But over time, maybe that moves over to passive sensors, which are more around, monitoring activities in the home, falls detection. And of course, that information then can be used for shared decision making with, say, a remote family member or caregiver.
Yeah.
John is eating today, they're drinking water. You've got smart devices like smart kettles, smart taps, all of these things. You can make anything in a house smart now, right? Really with a smart plug. And that's where the shared decision making and consent is really important, how much kind of information can be shared. Another thing that we've built in is cognitive stimulation and brain training. And we find that works very well because using AI, the brain training can adapt to the person's memory, their reasoning, and so on. So people don't get as frustrated as they would have done previously with, just as a static brain training game. And as your condition declines, it's more difficult for you to keep up. With AI, you can personalize and adapt that. And one of the things we're looking at now is using Gen AI for reminiscence therapy. It's like you were saying, that person, their memory, their lives, and that kind of disappears. So we're looking at fine-tuning language models with a person's life story. And then, the person can have a conversation with that conversational agent. So, John, tell me about the time you worked in the bakery in Rialto. What was that like? And I think, that opens up a whole world of possibilities there.
It blows my mind that only 5% of our listeners actually subscribe to the podcast. We've got one favour to ask. Please, can you subscribe to the podcast? If you like our content, you subscribing will make a huge difference to the guests that we can get on the show and also be a voice for AI applied across Ireland, but doing it the right way. Now back to the show. Have you noticed people that when they follow these routines and they have these different types of triggers, their self-confidence and kind of assurance increases because they've got more certainty about their day and they feel better about that? Would that be one kind of symptom of working well?
That's absolutely it. Yes. So engaging in activities regularly, right? That builds people's confidence. A dementia diagnosis is a huge knock to a person's confidence straight away. There's still a huge stigma attached to this condition. People are then kind of afraid to go out. They're afraid they'll get lost. So keeping going with those kind of routines, keeping that kind of interaction going is really, really important. And it's also really important in maintaining a person's autonomy, but also their dignity, right?
Yeah.
In terms of how they live their lives.
Because nobody wants to be seen as a burden, right?
Nobody. Yeah.
So there would be the feeling where you'd be thinking, actually, I'm going to hold back because I don't want for people to see me differently than they previously saw me before.
Yeah.
And that's where I suppose a little bit of kind of anxiety, shame, all these different types of things come true. And kind of similar to when you said someone comes in to assist you, you're almost saying you're less of a person now. We don't want you to hurry yourself. We want you just to look after yourself. Let us do the heavy lifting. Whereas the opposite, you almost want to keep them busy to say, actually, I want you to do more, or let's be part of the solution together. So it's probably just the context in terms of how you set it up.
I suppose one of the things we see a lot is kind of harming when trying to help.
Yeah.
Right? It's a real difficulty. So, we're very conscious that our tool is an aid. It's a stimulant. It, gets people going. It gets people moving. It gets people engaging with other people. And that's so important. That's how you maintain your cognitive, functions and abilities. And I suppose one of the things we feel really, really strongly about is that there has been such a limited involvement of people with age-related cognitive impairments in the design and the development of technology to support their own needs. And most of the technology is built around safety and monitoring, right? Somebody leaves the house and they get lost. These are the kind of use cases. But actually, this should be about empowering people with age-related cognitive impairments to take control of their own lives and to self-manage their condition. And the literature shows us that people in the mild to moderate early stages of dementia are really capable actors in self-management. So, our premise is that people with dementia should be at the center of their own decision making, and really involved in these kind of tools that can, aid them in more independence. And when we speak to people with dementia, the use cases they come up with are not something that we would think of at all.
I always remember back to that kind of movie Awakenings. Have you ever seen much with kind of music and kind of bringing people on that journey?
Yes.
Where they can kind of tell stories through that or bring them back to memories? Has that been a thing?
Music is huge, right? Because most of us, we associate music with, our younger selves, right? And socializing when we were younger, and music changes through the ages, and you associate music with events like weddings and so on. So it's absolutely huge. I mean, one of the things that we've seen that is super effective is, YouTube channels and looking up, music that is not like sort of available much on the, on the TV or whatever it is. So being able to kind of access those. Actually, as part of a different project that I'm working on, I co-lead a project called Age-Friendly AI, where we're developing a national AI literacy program for older adults, and that's a collaboration with TU Dublin and the Adapt Centre. But one of the things we're developing as part of that is an AI radio. So we have one of these very old style radios, with the knobs and the dials that you turn. But actually, we're going to use, say, the knobs and the dials for either, eras, it could be, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. We'll be looking at, also, we might not just be music, but it could be, for example, famous Irish speeches throughout time and so on. Yeah, and so this is a sort of an AI demonstrator that we're developing as part of the Age-Friendly AI project. But it's to engage people, older people as well, in the conversation about AI, right? To bring people into the conversation. Because one of the things we found through that project, the Age-Friendly AI, is that older adults kind of perceive that all of the conversation around AI is about young people spending too much time online, critical media literacy. It's about how AI will change how we work. There's nothing really about older adults, right? And how they can engage with AI.
But this is the thing where it freaks me out when people say to me who are kind of coming into retirement to say, oh, I'm so happy I'm getting to retirement now with all this AI coming. And what I'm saying to them is this is the time that you actually should stay in employment because you've had all this life experience. If you can utilize AI to come up with so many different ways to solve problems, you are primed for it. So I think they've got a completely mismatched around their kind of perspective on it. But again, I think that's just an education of how it's being positioned, where I think it's completely wrong. We were kind of joking about it before air with some of the research that came out about how you use ChatGPT, the impact to your brain, if we're getting smarter, if we're getting dumber, depending on our reliance on it as well. I always look at the sample size, and I always kind of look at kind of the research in a little bit more detail. But it is particularly interesting that depending on your approach to using ChatGPT, and I'm guessing this is not against slight on ChatGPT, it could be Copilot, Perplexity, Claude, Gemini, I'm guessing it could be them all, will have an impact on your on potentially your cognitive abilities in the future, particularly in the short term.
Absolutely. So that research that came out just very recently from MIT, so they asked the 3 different user groups to write essays. So one were totally unaided, no tools whatsoever, one group. A second group used Google search, and a third group used, I think it was ChatGPT, a kind of a generative AI tool. And I think what they found was that after the 3 groups had completed the task, 86% of those that had used the generative AI tool couldn't remember what they'd written. They couldn't remember a single quote from what they'd written. Whereas that only happened for 11% of those who had, written it completely unaided. So I think it's that kind of idea of that sort of very shallow engagement around, just sort of you're throwing things at it and it's coming back. And another thing I think they found was that a lot of what was coming back was almost exactly the same from the users who had used the generative AI tool. So it's kind of like homogenizing effect as well, potentially on creativity. So yeah, I and going back to your kind of previous point, I think actually to be able to use a lot of these generative AI tools, you really need that foundational knowledge. To what I would see, we've been talking a lot, obviously, in education Gen AI is a huge topic, right? And particularly in computer science, all of those kind of traditional coding assessments, for example, that we would give students are so vulnerable now to generative AI. And we're sort of thinking, well, we still have to teach computational thinking. We still have to teach that, right? And we got the students in, because I think one of the things that's actually kind of missing in a lot of this is the student voice. And what we noticed was that while they were using AI, and there was a very open session, how do you use AI, for example, not just, in your coding assessments and things like that, how do you use it? But they weren't using it very well. They were asking kind of very shallow questions, whereas if you had a much more experienced developer who kind of understood, or a much more experienced domain expert who really understood the problem that they were trying to solve, their prompts were so much better, and the information that they were getting back was so much better.
Yeah, and this is an incredibly important point, because so many people actually think they're good at using these AI models, but unless they've got a really good prompting framework, they'll get nowhere. And the difference of a prompt is like someone who asks a really well detailed question, and you're directing it, you can get completely different responses. But kind of coming back to domain expert, a domain expert will know the question to ask that really kind of cuts through. And also when it gives back a response, they will be able to decipher if it's hitting the nail on the head, or if it's maybe just kind of giving half the answer. And this is where I worry for students coming through who are graduating, particularly in consulting, where they straight away have to hit the ground running. But what they're having is using AI as this complete crutch. They come across as this 20-year vet, but then when you start to paper through the cracks, there's all these issues, and they don't know what's right or what's wrong, and they're getting charged out these exorbitant rates. And the only people that's losing are the customers and themselves, because what happens when they switch it off? You're a shadow of yourself, right? So it's a real kind of reliance. So
completely agree. And it's not even when you switch it off, when they come to a really difficult or more complex problems that they haven't been used to solving. I think there's a huge part that I think the trap we might fall into is that, we all learned when we were young through that kind of experiential learning. We went in, we saw how other people did it. We were given the sort of crappy problems, the simple problems to solve, but you learned, and you learned from those, and you built up to the sort of higher order tasks. But now if generative AI is replacing that, if it's doing all of that kind of simple stuff, how do you ever build up, to get to the complex problems?
Because you're completing the tenders with AI, then AI is reviewing the tenders, and then it's kind of like you got two humans discussing what nobody even knows what's in the process. So it is such a nuanced conversation. But what my biggest challenge is when people make a decision to use the tools or not to use for their organization, for their education, because they haven't been in the sandbox of using them themselves and they see the pros and cons, they're taking a very, very safe approach to say, well, this is what reporting back in. But until you're actually in the sandbox, trialing it, what's good, what's bad, what's indifferent, you're kind of talking this kind of third view, which isn't relevant because you don't quite know the challenges that it's going to bring. So my advice to the government from kind of the Taoiseach down is get into a workshop, use these tools, use them for your own documents, start to get a bit of a feel for what they can do. And then you'll have an understanding of where our society will go to, what they can actually do, but what's the challenges to it. Because I always see the narrative around, and you're probably getting this all as well, will AI take my job? What's society going to do? Which jobs are gone? Programmers, lawyers, all that stuff. And I was asked that last week. I want to flip the switch to being, well, what if we actually teach people to be more entrepreneurial, that they can actually don't necessarily have to go down a route where they work for someone else. They could also go and set up another business where we incentivize them to use some of the tools to create the job that they want to create, while maybe hiring one other person and trying to instill that. But if that's a conversation the government want to go down, that might be debatable, because it's a more challenging infrastructure of how you actually start to change that learning. But I believe we need to start to change how we're learning, how we're teaching, but how we're applying for future positions. And then education, that's a completely different how do we bring that into society? We're not going to answer that now, but it's obviously highly debatable.
Highly debatable. I am such an advocate of use the tools. Use the tools. We do a lot of, as I say, co-design work with older adults. First of all, they don't realize how much AI they're using. So, do
Yeah.
you use Netflix? Do you use Google Maps? Do you use Amazon? You're using AI. You're a super user and you
Yeah.
don't even realize it. Use the tools, right? It's hugely important that, we sort of break down these kind of barriers and get people to actually using the tools. But it all goes back to, I know a subject that's really key to your heart is AI literacy. It all goes back to AI literacy. So understanding the benefits, but the challenges, and then giving people the tools to be able to decide whether this is an appropriate use case, whether it's not, what should the guardrails be, how can we actually kind of get this to a shape or something, that will really work for our end users. And yeah, education is a completely kind of different use case.
Yeah, and then it can't be all put down to the education system as well to solve this nuanced problem, right?
No.
That's just too easy throwing it over the fence. It's having kind of a collective, systematic kind of approach to it as well, and having honest, trustful conversations.
And bringing the citizen voice into AI, I think that's really important. We've seen a lot of legislation, we see it kind of emerging all the time. And one of the big things that's missing from that a lot of the time is the citizen voice, So that kind of, teaching our citizens about AI. What is it? What are the benefits? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges?
Yeah, one of the challenges I see is people are so busy on the hamster wheel tunneling to get through to today that this seems like a far off subject that they don't have time to think about. But ironically enough, it's going to become ever present very, very quickly. Dympna O'Sullivan, thank you very much for joining us on the AI Ireland podcast.
Thank you very much, Mark.
At AI Ireland, we're helping over 1 million people become literate using artificial intelligence. And we do this in a variety of different ways. The easiest way is our AI literacy program, where we do a 60 to 90 minute program via virtual Zoom or Microsoft Teams, where we teach the rules of the road of AI from basic business concepts to ethical and resourceful decisions on how you actually use AI every day. This is our literacy foundation. The second way we use AI training is within our workshops. These are either virtual or in-person workshops where executive leaders come and use some of the AI tools that we make available for them, that they can actually start to take their own documents and reimagine savings of time and energy, but taking away friction from the work that they do each day. Later on, we actually empower different departments, HR, finance, sales, marketing, operations, and start to utilize AI across relevant use cases to upskill their different types of departments. If you're interested and ready to go on your AI journey, we'll be able to showcase over 700 applications of applied AI about how you can actually stop reinventing the wheel and start using AI for your organization today. If you want to start out and find out a little bit about the golden thread of activities that we've got to allow you to start to utilize AI straight away, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll give you a good comprehensive overview about the arts of the possible, minus the hype, purely applied. See you then.